Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into a world where the air smells of hearth smoke, freshly baked rye bread, and a faint yeasty tang drifting out of a wooden brewing vat. The year is 1325, and you're standing in the crowded square of a bustling English market town. Merchants bark out their prices for salted herring and bolts of wool. Peasants shuffle by with baskets of onions and turnips, and from a nearby tavern comes the roar of laughter, mixed with the clatter of wooden cups being slammed against rough-hewn tables. Somewhere in the distance, a church bell tolls noon, echoing through crooked timbered houses. You might not notice it yet, but in every corner of this place, whether in a noble's cellar, a monastery's refectory, or a peasant's hut, liquid fills the gaps where clean water often fails. Ale, wine, and mead are not just beverages here, they're the bloodstream of the medieval world. And yes, spoiler alert, if you try to survive this century without them, you'll probably end up very, very dead. So welcome to why ale, wine, and mead shaped the medieval world. Grab your wooden mug because tonight we're going to sip our way through the history of these drinks, exploring why they mattered so deeply, how they were made, and the ways they quietly directed the flow of society. If you're the kind of person who thinks a beverage can't change the course of history, well, just remember, wars have been fought with less fuel than what sat in a single monastery's wine cellar. Now, before we dive into the bubbling vats and sticky honeycombs, here's a little nudge for you. If you're watching this while sipping something, whether it's tea, juice, or maybe something a bit stronger, drop your location and your local time in the comments. Let's see who's raising a cup with us across the world right now. And when the night finally winds down, don't forget to hit subscribe, because trust me, the story of medieval booze is only the beginning. After all, history is always better shared with a drink in hand. The truth is, ale, wine, and mead shaped nearly every corner of medieval life. You trudged to work in the fields, you ended your day in the tavern, you prayed at mass, and wine appeared at the altar. You marked marriages, treaties, and even funerals with ritual cups raised high. If you were sick, alcohol was in your medicine. If you were rich, the kind of alcohol you displayed was your social status carved into glass or wood. And if you were poor, you brewed your own because life without ale was unthinkable. In short, these were not optional luxuries. They were essential fuels, cultural markers, and survival strategies rolled into liquid form. You start to see how vital they were when you remember something simple. Medieval water sources were often dangerous. Wells could be contaminated, streams carried animal waste, and even city fountains could turn nasty if someone upstream dumped refuse. Fermented drinks, whether ale from barley, wine from grapes, or mead from honey, were safer to drink because the brewing process killed or suppressed pathogens. It's not that people never drank water, but if you wanted to survive long enough to complain about the taste of weak ale, you needed fermentation on your side. So what looks to us like an indulgence was, to them, just basic hydration strategy. Ale formed the daily heartbeat. In northern Europe, grain grew more easily than grapes, so barley and oats became the foundation of liquid bread. A peasant family might brew a weak ale for children and stronger batches for adults, often recycling the same mash to squeeze out every last drop of nutrition. Wine, by contrast, flowed most strongly in southern climates, France, Italy, the Iberian Peninsula, where vineyards thrived and grape cultivation stretched back to Roman legacies. Wine was not just a drink, but a cultural identity, bound up in Catholic rituals, aristocratic dining, and the booming trade networks that carried casks from Bordeaux to London. Mead, the sweet child of honey and water, occupied a more northern niche. It thrived in Scandinavia, in the Baltic, and wherever bees could be coaxed into producing enough honey to ferment. Mead carried an aura of myth and poetry, often tied to weddings and celebrations, less common for everyday swigging than ale or wine. But don't think of these drinks as existing in neat little silos. They constantly overlapped. A wealthy English noble might drink French claret at dinner, yet still keep ale flowing for the servants. A Scandinavian merchant might toast with mead in a hall, but trade for Rhine wine when he wanted to impress guests. In bustling ports, barrels of ale, amphorae of wine, and jugs of mead crossed paths, mingling traditions and recipes. This was a liquid economy as much as it was a solid one. You can't really understand medieval politics, religion, or daily survival without putting these beverages at the centre. Think of coronations, where bishops anointed kings while feasts soaked in wine and ale. Think of monasteries, where monks brewed beer not only to sustain themselves during long fasts, but also to sell, becoming economic powerhouses. Think of peasants, whose daily labour was literally fueled by weak ale calories. Or think of the Crusades, when warriors heading east carried barrels of wine as carefully as they carried swords. These drinks shaped alliances, fed armies, and filled treasuries with taxes. The funny part is, while everyone drank them, not everyone drank the same way. Class lines showed up clearly in your cup. Peasants got the rougher, weaker ale, often cloudy and unrefined, while nobles boasted crystal goblets of imported vintage wine. Monks split the difference, drinking heartier, more carefully brewed ales that could outshine anything peasants managed at home. Mead, meanwhile, played the role of a special occasion luxury, sweet, strong, and expensive, often reserved for moments when memory and ritual mattered more than thirst. If ale was your daily bread, mead was your wedding cake. The scale of production itself was astonishing. Brewing ale wasn't just something individuals did at home, it was an industry. Cities had laws regulating how alewives could sell, monasteries built vast brewing halls, and rulers taxed the stuff relentlessly. Wine production, too, was deeply institutionalized. Vineyards spread across Europe, tended with almost obsessive detail, their output tied not just to local diets, but to export wealth. A bad harvest could cripple entire economies. Honey for Mead, meanwhile, connected humans directly to bees. Beekeeping was labour-intensive, dangerous, and yet prized for both the honey and the wax, which fueled candles for churches. Every jar of mead carried with it the hum of 1,000 bees' wings. Of course, alcohol didn't only shape survival and economy, it shaped culture. Songs, poems, and sagas sang the praises of mead halls where warriors boasted under smoky rafters. Medieval art painted taverns filled with drinkers, sometimes as moral warnings, sometimes just as everyday snapshots. Religious writers both condemned drunkenness and recognized that moderate drinking was inevitable. Even medicine folded alcohol into its repertoire. Wine disinfected wounds, ale soothed stomachs, mead mixed with herbs became potions. Doctors of the time couldn't imagine healing without a bottle close at hand. And through it all, these drinks stitched together medieval identity. To drink was to participate in a shared rhythm of life, celebrating feast days, sealing marriages, honouring the dead, and breaking bread with neighbours. Without ale, wine, and mead, the medieval world would not only have been thirstier, it would have been unrecognisable. That's the landscape we're stepping into, a world where your survival strategy, your social status, your health, and even your soul could be poured into a wooden cup. Now, as we move forward, we'll start zooming into each of these drinks more closely. How ale was brewed, how monasteries refined the process, how vineyards reshaped economies, and how honey carried cultural weight. But never forget this starting point. These weren't background details. They were the beating heart of medieval life, pulsing in every sip, shaping history one mug at a time. You wake up early in a damp little cottage, and before you've even rubbed the sleep from your eyes, there's the smell of something simmering over the hearth. It's not soup, it's not porridge, it's ale, slowly bubbling in a wide iron pot because brewing isn't a once-in-a-while job. It's part of the rhythm of survival. To the medieval peasant, brewing ale was as normal and necessary as baking bread, because in many ways it was the same thing. Grains, water, heat, and yeast transformed into nourishment, except this time the end product poured into mugs instead of sliced onto a wooden board. Ale wasn't a luxury or even a treat. It was the foundation of everyday life, the liquid bread that carried people through back-breaking labour in the fields and endless chilly nights. The recipe itself looked deceptively simple. First you had grain, usually barley if you could get it, but oats, wheat or rye, if that's what the harvest allowed. Barley was the favourite because it malted so well, but peasants weren't picky. You soaked the grains in water until they sprouted just enough to release their natural sugars, then dried them in a kiln or over a smoky fire. This was malting, the magic stage that turned dull cereal into fermentable material. You crushed it, mixed it with hot water, and stirred until the mash turned into a soupy, sticky mess. Then came boiling, often with herbs tossed in. Not hops yet, not in most of Europe at this point, but things like bog myrtle, heather, or yarrow. The result was earthy, sometimes bitter, sometimes floral. It was ale, but don't picture a golden pint with a frothy head. Picture a cloudy, brownish liquid with bits of grain still floating around, poured into a rough wooden tankard. And no, carbonation wasn't really a thing yet. So the fizz you expect in beer today? Forget it. Brewing was often a household task, and in most cases it was women's work. The alewife stood at the centre of this process, her life revolving around batches of ale that needed constant watching. Families consumed gallons of the stuff every week, and it spoiled fast. Without refrigeration, weak ale might sour in just a couple of days, so brewing wasn't a seasonal project, it was an endless cycle. Brew, drink, brew again. The weaker the ale, the faster you went through it. The stronger the ale, the longer it lasted. But strong ale also cost more in grain, which meant peasants usually saved it for special occasions. A typical household might brew 2 or 3 strengths from a single mash. The first run, strong ale, packed the most punch. Adults might save this for harvest festivals, or when neighbours visited. The second run, small ale, was weaker but still nourishing. That was the daily drink, something you could quench your thirst with after ploughing a field or while sharing a midday meal of bread, cheese and onions. The third run, sometimes called smallest ale, was practically flavoured water but still safer than drinking straight from a stream. This was often given to children, the elderly, or anyone needing hydration without the risk of intoxication. It's wild to think about toddlers sipping ale today, but in the Middle Ages a weak brew was considered healthier than a mug of raw river water. Ale gave people energy too. Barley and oats carried calories, proteins, and vitamins into liquid form. For peasants living on bread, beans and vegetables, ale provided variety, flavour, and most importantly, fuel. A labourer might drink several litres a day, especially during harvest season when sweating in the fields demanded constant refuelling. Imagine swinging a scythe for 12 hours. Would you rather have lukewarm, possibly contaminated pond water, or a bellyful of liquid bread with a buzz? Exactly. Of course, brewing wasn't just about survival, it was social. If your household produced more ale than you could drink before it soured, you sold it to your neighbours. That made ale not just nourishment, but also currency. Alewives hung out signs, sometimes a broomstick over the door, to show a fresh batch was ready. People would gather, trade coins for cups, and swap gossip over mugs. It was the medieval version of a cafe, except instead of caffeine, everyone got a gentle buzz. But while this was good for community, it also caught the eye of local authorities. Governments realised very quickly that if everyone needed ale, then everyone would pay taxes on it. And so, brewing shifted from a household necessity to a regulated, taxable industry. The scale of consumption is almost hard to believe. Records from medieval England suggest that even modest households consumed dozens of gallons of ale every week. Monasteries, which we'll get to soon, brewed in industrial volumes, but even small villages lived on ale as their primary drink. If you visited a peasant home, chances are there was always a pot bubbling on the fire or a jug tucked away in a cool corner, and because ale was so perishable, it created a rhythm of constant renewal. Brewing was less of an art and more of a survival clock, ticking endlessly from one batch to the next. Of course, not every batch turned out right. Medieval brewing didn't have the luxury of sterile equipment, consistent yeast strains, or precise thermometers. Sometimes the ale went sour too fast. Sometimes contamination made it undrinkable. People joke that bad ale could kill you faster than water, though usually it just made you spit and curse. Still, enough batches turned out drinkable that the cycle kept rolling. And over time, experience built expertise. Villages knew which women brewed the best ale, and word spread quickly when a particularly fine batch was ready. Ale houses sprang up as central gathering places, supplying something more reliable than homebrew. And then there's the flavour. Forget the crisp lagers or citrusy IP as you know today. Medieval ale was heavy, rustic, and often thick. Some described it as bread in a cup, and honestly that's not far off. It was chewy, sometimes smoky from the kilning process, and earthy from the herbs mixed in. No hops yet. That revolution would come later, mostly from German regions, but plenty of other plants added bitter notes. It was less about taste, more about calories and safety. Still, when you've spent all day bent over in a muddy field, even cloudy, lukewarm ale hits the spot. Children grew up on ale. Old people lived their last years with ale by their beds. It was breakfast, lunch, and dinner. You could work while drinking it, gossip while sipping it, and pray while monks blessed it. It was so constant that many medieval people probably didn't even think of it as alcohol in the way we do now. Sure, strong ale could make you stumble, but the weaker stuff just kept life moving. It's almost funny. Today, if someone drinks beer all day, they're labelled a problem. Back then, if you didn't drink ale, people might assume you were either ill, cursed, or rich enough to import something fancier. Brewing also marked the gender line in interesting ways. Women brewed for their households, but as towns grew and demand increased, men started muscling into the trade, especially once taxes and profits came into play. Alewives faced suspicion, sometimes accused of watering down ale or cheating customers. Their reputation became a cultural stereotype, depicted in art and plays as greedy or loose, blamed for drunkenness, yet utterly essential to community life. Without alewives, villages went thirsty, but as brewing scaled up, guilds and monasteries began dominating the industry, slowly pushing women out of what had once been their domain. Ale wasn't fancy, and it wasn't meant to be. It was the glue of daily survival, binding medieval families and villages together in a cycle of brewing, drinking, and brewing again. Without it, peasants would have lacked calories, communities would have lacked safe hydration, and governments would have lost a massive source of taxation. Ale kept workers in the fields, armies marching, and households alive. So when you think about medieval life, don't picture people wandering around with leather flasks of water. Picture them sipping cloudy mugs of ale with every meal, wiping foam from their beards and handing small cups to their children. Picture ale not as an occasional drink, but as the pulse of existence. Every sip was another step through the grind of survival, a reminder that grain and yeast held civilization together as much as kings and castles. And the next time you crack open a modern beer, remember, you're not just drinking for pleasure. You're echoing the survival strategy of millions who came before, when ale wasn't a choice, but life itself. You step through the heavy wooden gates of a medieval monastery, and the first thing you notice isn't silence, it's the smell. Yeast, malt, and damp stone all mixed together, drifting from vast brewing halls tucked behind cloisters. Monks shuffle past in coarse wool robes, muttering prayers under their breath, but don't be fooled. These aren't just men of God. They're also some of the best brewers in Europe. Monastic brewing became legendary not because monks were especially thirsty, though, let's be honest, they were, but because the monastery was perfectly designed for experimentation, consistency, and large-scale production. What began as a way to sustain a community of brothers turned into one of the medieval world's most important industries, setting standards that shaped beer and ale traditions for centuries. Picture a typical monastery in the 12th or 13th century. Behind the soaring church and orderly gardens, you'd find specialised buildings, refectories for meals, dormitories for sleeping, scriptoria for copying books, and yes, entire breweries and bakeries. Brewing wasn't some side hobby. It was part of the rhythm of the rule of St. Benedict, which emphasised self-sufficiency. Monks needed nourishment during long fasts, and liquid bread provided exactly that. Ale carried calories, vitamins, and hydration without breaking fast rules, meaning it became central to the monastic diet. If you've ever envied someone for finding a loophole in a system, the monks were the champions. Can't eat meat today? Fine. Drink 2 or 3 hearty mugs of ale instead. Monasteries had key advantages over peasant brewers. First, they had access to resources. Land donations gave them fields of barley and wheat. Tithes and rents often came in the form of grain, honey, or even vineyards. That meant monks could brew in volumes unimaginable for small households. Where a peasant family might produce a few gallons at a time, monasteries churned out barrels by the dozens. Second, they had stability. Monasteries were permanent institutions, not subject to the chaos of warlords or famine in quite the same way households were. That stability allowed monks to refine recipes, document methods, and pass down knowledge across generations. Their brewing halls became laboratories of innovation. Early on, monastic brews looked like the same cloudy herbal ales peasants made. But over time, monks began experimenting with ingredients. Herbs gave way eventually to hops, first popularized in German regions. Hops added bitterness, balanced sweetness, and, most importantly, preserved beer for longer storage. For monasteries, that was a game changer. No longer did every batch sour within days. Now beer could be stored, sold, and shipped without turning into vinegar halfway to market. While not every region adopted hops immediately, England clung to unhopped ales for centuries. The monastic influence made hopped beer a continental force. But even before hops, monks had perfected consistency. They controlled malting processes, built stone kilns, and measured boiling times with the precision of prayer schedules. If the bell rang for sext, you knew exactly how long the mash had boiled. Their devotion to order spilled into brewing, making monastic ale far more reliable than the average alewife's unpredictable batch. That consistency built reputations, and soon, monasteries weren't just feeding themselves, they were supplying local communities. Villagers lined up for monastic ale because it was cleaner, stronger, and longer lasting. The economic implications were huge. Brewing became a revenue stream for monasteries, funding everything from church construction to manuscript production. Some abbeys grew so wealthy from brewing and selling ale that they dominated regional economies. Think of them as the Starbucks franchises of the medieval world, except instead of a paper cup with your name scribbled wrong, you got a wooden mug overflowing with strong foamy ale, and just like Starbucks, they had branding power. Certain monasteries gained fame for the quality of their brew, drawing in pilgrims and merchants who boosted the local economy even further. Monks weren't just businessmen, though. They connected brewing to spirituality. Beer wasn't framed as indulgence, but as nourishment, a way to sustain the body while serving God. Art from the time shows monks smiling over tankards, a gentle wink at the idea that holiness and a good pint weren't mutually exclusive. Of course, critics pointed out the hypocrisy of holy men profiting from alcohol, but the church largely tolerated it, recognizing that brewing supported communities and filled coffers. Besides, moderate drinking was accepted. It was drunkenness that drew moral condemnation, and who better than monks to assure everyone they were keeping things moderate, most of the time. The scale of production in some monasteries was staggering. In places like Bavaria and Flanders, records suggest annual outputs measured in thousands of gallons. Breweries expanded into multiple rooms, malting chambers, mash tuns, fermentation cellars, and cool storage areas dug into earth or stone. Monks understood fermentation's mysteries better than most, even if they lacked modern microbiology. They learned how to reuse yeast sediments, how temperature shaped flavour, and how to keep barrels sealed tight. While peasants might shrug at a spoiled batch, monks catalogued successes and failures meticulously. That careful observation planted seeds of scientific brewing that modern beer still rests on. And then there's the taste. Monastic beer often leaned heavier, darker, and richer than peasant ale. With more grain at their disposal, monks could afford thicker mashes. With better equipment, they could control roasting for different flavours. Over time, regional specialties emerged. Stronger, maltier beers in some regions, lighter, crisper ones elsewhere. These differences weren't just accidents. They were intentional, crafted identities. If you travelled across Europe, you could taste the difference between a Belgian abbey brew and a Bavarian one, centuries before branding and export defined national beer styles. Of course, not all was idyllic. Brewing on such a scale required labour, and monasteries often relied on lay brothers or hired workers to keep vats stirred and barrels hauled. Conflicts arose when secular brewers accused monks of unfair competition. After all, how could an alewife's homebrew compete with a monastery's industrial-scale operation? In some towns, local guilds pushed for restrictions on monastic brewing, arguing that religious houses had an unfair advantage. This tension reveals just how central brewing had become to the medieval economy. It wasn't just about thirst anymore, it was about power, profit, and market share. Monastic brewing also intersected with pilgrimage culture. Imagine walking for weeks toward a holy site, feet blistered, throat dry, and then arriving at an abbey offering food, shelter, and a mug of ale brewed with care. Pilgrims carried stories of these brews back home, spreading reputations and encouraging trade. Over time, certain abbeys became as famous for their beer as for their relics. That's some serious multitasking. Come for the saint's bones, stay for the strong ale. The long-term influence of monastic brewing is hard to overstate. Even today, the tradition lives on in Trappist beers, still brewed under monastic supervision in parts of Belgium and the Netherlands. When you sip one, you're tasting a legacy stretching back to those smoky brewing halls of the 12th century. The names of monasteries like Chimay, Orval and Westmalle still echo the medieval intertwining of faith, discipline and fermentation. What's striking is how monastic brewing bridged the gap between survival and sophistication. Peasants needed ale to live, nobles wanted wine to flaunt. But monasteries created something in between. A drink that nourished the humble yet impressed the powerful, a product rooted in faith yet thriving in commerce. By doing so, they turned brewing from household chore into organised industry, planting seeds for the beer culture that dominates so much of the world today. Next time you pass a craft brewery boasting about heritage recipes, remember that monks were there first, stirring mash with prayer beads dangling from their wrists, inventing consistency out of chaos, and bottling both survival and spirituality in a single foamy cup. Monastic beer wasn't just about getting through another day. It was about turning necessity into art, commerce, and community. And whether you were a pilgrim, a peasant, or a prince, you probably agreed. Nothing tasted quite like a monk's brew after a long, hard day in the medieval world. Step into the rolling hills of Burgundy in the year 1250, and you'll see rows upon rows of vines stretching across the landscape, their twisted branches tied carefully to wooden stakes. The sun beats down on ripening grapes, the air buzzing faintly with insects, and the faint chatter of peasants echoes between the rows as they prune, tie, and harvest. Wine isn't just a drink here. It's a lifeblood of economy, culture, and faith. While northern Europe leaned heavily on ale, the southern half of the continent flourished on wine. From the vineyards of France and Italy to the coastal hills of Spain and Portugal, wine defined not only what people drank but also how they thought about themselves, their class, and their place in the Christian world. You can't talk about medieval wine without starting with geography. Grapes need warmth and sun, but also the right soils. Southern France, northern Italy, and the Iberian Peninsula provided perfect conditions. The Romans had already established vineyards centuries earlier, and many regions simply carried on those traditions. Monasteries played a major role here too. Just as they brewed ale in northern climates, they cultivated vineyards in southern ones. The Benedictines and later the Cistercians became masters of viticulture, keeping meticulous records of soil, slopes, and grape varieties. They knew which patches of land produced sweeter grapes, which slopes caught the morning sun, and which valleys protected against frost. That obsession laid the foundations of what we'd later call terroir, the deep connection between land and wine that still drives the industry today. But wine wasn't evenly spread across Europe. In England, for example, vineyards existed but struggled against the cooler, wetter climate. English kings loved wine, though, so they imported it by the cask from Bordeaux, a region that became a juggernaut of medieval wine production. Thanks to the marriage of Eleanor of Aquitaine to Henry II in 1152, the English crown controlled huge swathes of French territory, and Bordeaux wine, known as claret, flooded into England. By the 13th century, London taverns brimmed with it, and the English upper classes developed a taste so strong that Bordeaux's economy became practically tied to their drinking habits. Italy, meanwhile, thrived with the diversity of wines. Tuscany's rolling hills produced robust reds, while Venetian merchants shipped sweet Mediterranean wines across Europe. Spain and Portugal, under both Christian and Muslim rule, cultivated grapes too, though Islamic prohibitions on alcohol complicated the picture. Even so, wine remained central to trade and diet, sometimes slipping past religious bans under the guise of medicinal or non-intoxicating uses. The demand was simply too high to ignore. At its core, wine carried more symbolic weight than ale ever did. Ale was sustenance, wine was civilization. It tied directly into religion. During the Catholic Mass, wine became the blood of Christ, a sacred substance consumed by clergy and laity alike. That meant every church needed a reliable supply of wine, regardless of local climate. Even in regions too cold for vineyards, wine had to be imported for sacramental use. This gave southern vineyards not just economic power, but spiritual leverage. Controlling wine meant controlling access to the holiest ritual in medieval Christianity. Wine also carried class distinctions sharper than ale. Nobles and wealthy merchants displayed their status by the quality of their vintages. Fine wines aged in barrels or amphorae were markers of wealth, while peasants drank rougher, sourer versions. In fact, lower classes often drank piquette, a weak wine made by re-soaking grape skins after the main pressing. It was thin, acidic, and barely alcoholic, but still safer than plain water. In this way, wine reinforced social hierarchies. The poor sipped the scraps, the wealthy toasted with the finest Bordeaux, and the church sanctified the entire spectrum. Production itself was labour-intensive and seasonal. Harvesting grapes required armies of workers, often entire villages mobilised for the task. Crushing grapes was done by foot in large vats, sticky, messy, and exhausting work. Juice flowed into wooden barrels, where fermentation began spontaneously thanks to wild yeasts. Unlike modern winemakers, medieval vintners had little control over the process. Some batches turned out delicious, others soured into vinegar. Storage was another challenge. Barrels leaked, wines oxidized, and spoilage was common. But even flawed wines found uses, whether in cooking, medicine, or as acidic cleaning agents. Waste wasn't an option in a world where every resource counted. Trade routes carried wine far beyond vineyard regions. Ships loaded with casks sailed up the Atlantic coast, into the English Channel, or across the Mediterranean. Overland caravans hauled barrels by cart, though fragile containers and bumpy roads meant spillage was frequent. Still, the demand was relentless. Cities like Paris, London, and Bruges developed specialised wine markets, while taverns sprang up to serve imported vintages to thirsty urban populations. The culture surrounding wine became deeply embedded in medieval identity. Poets sang of its pleasures, scholars debated its moral dangers, and medical writers praised its health benefits. According to Galenic medicine, wine balanced humours, warmed the body, and aided digestion. Doctors prescribed different wines for different conditions, light whites for fevers, heavy reds for chills, spiced mulled wine for stomach troubles. It was both cure and curse, depending on the dose. Moralists warned against drunkenness, but almost no one advocated complete abstinence. The line between medicine and indulgence blurred with every goblet. Then there's the political angle. Control of vineyards, trade routes, and wine taxes meant immense wealth for rulers. The English crown depended heavily on Bordeaux wine duties, while French kings relied on Burgundy's prestige. Wars sometimes pivoted around these resources. During the 100 Years' War, wine regions became strategic prizes, their exports funding armies and shaping alliances. Merchants too wielded power. The wine trade tied together far-flung regions in networks of profit, ensuring that even in an era of fragmented feudalism, people were linked by what filled their cups. Of course, wine could also divide. It highlighted class barriers in ways ale never did. Nobles sneered at common ale drinkers, while peasants joked about nobles who couldn't hold their claret. This liquid divide mirrored broader social inequalities, with wine reinforcing the prestige of those at the top. Yet paradoxically, the shared act of drinking still united communities. At feasts, everyone drank, just from different barrels. The hall roared with laughter, songs, and spilled wine, a temporary moment when status blurred, even if only for a night. The technology of winemaking advanced slowly but steadily. Barrel making improved, with coopers perfecting techniques to seal casks tightly. Glass bottles were rare but gradually introduced, mainly for the wealthy. Additives like herbs, honey, or spices sometimes masked sourness, leading to early forms of mulled wine or hippocras, a sweetened, spiced drink popular at banquets. These innovations expanded the variety of flavours and styles available, laying groundwork for the diverse wine cultures we know today. In many ways, medieval wine was unpredictable, sometimes sublime, sometimes undrinkable, but its role was never in question. It wasn't just a drink. It was a cultural marker, a religious necessity, a political weapon, and an economic powerhouse. Whether flowing from chalices at mass, goblets in noble halls, or rough mugs in village taverns, wine soaked into the very fabric of medieval life. Imagine yourself in a tavern in London around 1300. The air is thick with smoke and chatter. A merchant boasts of his latest shipment from Gascony. A clerk haggles for a cheaper mug of sour piquette. In the corner, a friar blesses his cup before sipping. Everyone drinks, but what they drink and how they drink it says everything about who they are. That's the power of wine in the medieval world. It was never just about thirst. It was about identity, faith, and power, all fermented in a barrel and poured into your hand. You find yourself walking along the edge of a medieval village in Scandinavia, the summer sun hanging low and golden over fields dotted with hives. Wooden skeps, woven baskets covered with clay and dung, buzz with the restless energy of thousands of bees. A beekeeper, face hidden behind a rough veil of cloth, smokes the hive with a bundle of burning herbs, trying to calm the bees long enough to pull out heavy combs dripping with honey. The sweet, sticky treasure isn't just destined for porridge or candles. Some of it will be mixed with water and left to ferment into one of humanity's oldest drinks, mead. In northern Europe, where vineyards struggled and grain often went to bread before beer, mead carried a special place in culture, diet, and myth. Mead's origins stretch deep into prehistory. Unlike ale or wine, which require cultivation and processing, mead can form naturally. Rainwater pools in a hollow tree mixes with wild honeycomb and ferments with airborne yeast. Humans, curious as always, discovered this process thousands of years ago and never let it go. By the Middle Ages, mead was already ancient, wrapped in tradition, legend, and ritual. Unlike ale, brewed daily in countless homes, mead was rarer, more precious, and more symbolic. The basic recipe was simple: honey, water, and thyme. But the results could vary wildly. Strong meads required large amounts of honey, making them expensive and often reserved for elites or special occasions. Lighter versions, sometimes called short meads, or quick meads, were weaker and more accessible, though still pricier than ale. Herbs and spices, juniper, heather, cloves, or cinnamon imported from trade routes, were often added for flavour and preservation. Some recipes included fruit like cherries or apples, creating sweeter, more complex drinks. Unlike ale, which spoiled quickly, mead could last longer if stored properly, adding to its status as a luxury. Honey itself was precious in the medieval world. Sugar from cane was an exotic, expensive import from the Mediterranean and later from the East, so honey was the main sweetener for most of Europe. That meant bees were central to medieval life. Beekeeping required skill, patience, and, let's be honest, a strong tolerance for stings. Hives produced not only honey, but beeswax, which lit churches and homes in the form of candles. Monasteries often kept extensive apiaries, tending bees with the same diligence they gave vineyards or brewing halls. Wax was crucial for religious rituals, an unbroken flame symbolizing purity and prayer, while honey flavored foods, medicines, and of course, mead. Every sip of mead was a reminder of the labor of bees and the value of their golden product. Mead had a cultural resonance that ale and wine never quite matched. In the sagas of Norse mythology, mead was the drink of gods and heroes. The mead of poetry granted wisdom and inspiration. While mead halls in epic tales served as the backdrop for boasting, feasting, and the forging of alliances, warriors gathered in great wooden halls, horns raised high as mead flowed beneath carved beams. These stories weren't just myth. They reflected a real cultural practice where communal drinking of mead symbolized unity, strength, and loyalty. A lord who provided mead to his followers wasn't just feeding them, he was binding them to him with ritualized generosity. Weddings, too, carried Mead's signature. The term honeymoon comes from the tradition of giving newlyweds a supply of mead to last a lunar month, ensuring fertility and happiness in their marriage. The sweetness of the drink symbolized abundance and new beginnings. It's one of those linguistic echoes that reminds us how deeply mead was tied to life milestones. Imagine standing in a smoky hall watching a bride and groom share their first ceremonial sip from a carved horn, while guests cheer and honey-sweetened songs fill the rafters. Yet mead wasn't as widespread as ale or wine. Its production depended heavily on access to honey, which was limited and labour-intensive. Grain could be grown in vast fields, grapes could be cultivated across regions, but bees required careful tending and produced finite amounts. That scarcity meant mead was less of an everyday drink and more of a ceremonial one. Peasants might taste mead only on special feast days or at a lord's table. Monasteries brewed it occasionally, but even there ale dominated daily consumption. Mead carried prestige precisely because it was rare. Its medicinal uses also added to its value. Medieval medical texts often recommended mead for various ailments. Mixed with herbs, it became a tonic for digestion, a soothing drink for sore throats, or a treatment for melancholy. Physicians saw honey as a balancing agent, and fermented honey water fit neatly into their humoral theories. Of course, it probably didn't cure much, but a sweet warming drink surely made patients feel better, which in medieval terms was half the battle. The flavour of mead set it apart. While ale was hearty and earthy, and wine varied from sour to robust, mead was sweet, smooth, and sometimes deceptively strong. A well-aged mead could pack quite a punch, warming the drinker from the inside out. Served in horns, cups, or even bowls, it carried a sense of ceremony with every sip. This wasn't just about quenching thirst, it was about marking a moment, whether in myth, marriage, or medicine. Trade routes helped spread mead beyond its core regions. Honey from Baltic forests, Russian plains, or English meadows could be traded long distances, and mead recipes travelled with it. Merchants carried bottles across rivers and seas, offering exotic variations in markets and courts. Still, mead never reached the sheer volume of ale or wine. Its cultural importance outweighed its economic footprint, making it more a drink of memory and identity than of daily life. The symbolic nature of mead shows up again and again in literature and ritual. In Beowulf, the Mead Hall of Heorot represents more than a building. It embodies community, order, and the generosity of the king. When Grendel attacks it, he's not just destroying a place of drinking, he's shattering the bonds of society. That's how powerful mead was in the medieval imagination. It wasn't just a drink, it was the glue that held people together. Still, mead wasn't immune to decline. As hops spread in brewing and wine trade grew across Europe, mead gradually became less central. By the later Middle Ages, it was increasingly seen as old-fashioned or provincial, associated more with northern fringes than with the cosmopolitan centres of Europe. But even as it faded from prominence, it left behind a golden afterglow in stories, traditions, and language. Imagine yourself back in that Scandinavian hall. Torches flicker against carved wooden beams, smoke curling toward the rafters. Warriors pound their fists on the table, a skald begins a song, and a servant pours golden mead into a polished horn. You raise it, the sweet liquid catching in your beard as you drink, and for a moment you feel part of something larger than yourself, a chain of memory stretching from bees in the meadow to gods in the sagas. Mead may not have filled daily mugs the way ale or wine did, but in the medieval world it filled imaginations. You stand at the edge of a muddy village well in 14th century England. A few women line up with wooden buckets, their aprons already damp from spilled water. The air carries a faint sour odour, and as one woman lowers her rope, you notice a dead rat floating just beneath the surface. Nobody screams, nobody runs. They sigh, push it aside with a stick and carry on, because this is water in the medieval world. Unpredictable, often filthy, and very often dangerous. Here lies one of the most overlooked truths of the Middle Ages. People didn't drink ale, wine, and mead only for the pleasure of it. They drank them because, quite simply, alcohol was safer than water. Now that doesn't mean medieval people never touched water. They did, of course. Springs, wells, and streams provided it, and in rural areas where populations were thin, some water could be relatively clean. But in towns and cities, contamination was constant. Animals wandered freely, waste was dumped into ditches, and latrines leaked into groundwater. Rainwater collection helped, but it wasn't always enough. If you gulped raw water from a stream running near a village, you risked dysentery, typhoid, or any number of gastrointestinal nightmares. And in a world without antibiotics, a simple case of the runs could weaken you to the point of death. Drinking water was, frankly, a gamble you probably wouldn't want to take. Fermentation provided a solution. Brewing ale, fermenting wine, or mixing honey for mead required boiling or heating water, which killed many pathogens. Then, yeast took over. As it consumed sugars, it produced alcohol, carbon dioxide, and acids that made the liquid less hospitable to harmful bacteria. Even low-alcohol small ale or thin piquette had enough fermentation byproducts to make it safer than untreated water. You didn't need to know the microbiology to appreciate the difference. People saw that those who drank ale or wine lived healthier, longer lives than those who relied on raw water. So without ever naming E. coli or salmonella, they built a culture around fermented safety. Daily routines reflected this. A peasant might start his morning with a bowl of bread soaked in weak ale instead of porridge. Workers in the fields paused midday to drink from shared jugs, not of water but of small ale, refreshing yet nourishing. Even children grew up sipping watered-down or second-run ale. It was never about getting drunk. It was about staying alive. When medieval writers noted how much people drank each day, the numbers sound staggering to us. Several litres for an adult was normal, but most of that was weak ale, the medieval equivalent of lightly flavoured, nutrient-rich hydration. Wine regions had their own version of this safety net. In Italy, Spain, or southern France, people drank diluted wine daily. It wasn't considered odd to water wine down. In fact, undiluted wine was sometimes associated with barbarism. The Greeks and Romans had already set the cultural precedent. Civilized people mixed their wine, barbarians guzzled it neat. By continuing that practice, medieval southern Europe made wine not only a drink of prestige, but a practical hydrating staple. Mead, though less common, also fit into this category. When brewed weak, it provided a safe, sweet alternative to water. For children, or the sick, a diluted mead with herbs might be prescribed as a safer liquid than a questionable well. In every case, fermentation gave people a shield against unseen dangers in their environment. The link between alcohol and safety shaped how medieval people understood health. Physicians writing in the Galenic tradition emphasized balance of humours, but they consistently praised fermented drinks as gentler on the stomach than raw water. Wine especially was considered clean and warming, perfect for aiding digestion. Ale was recognised as nourishing, though doctors sometimes worried it was heavy and caused phlegm. Even mead earned a reputation as a healing drink, especially when infused with herbs. Medical advice, cultural practice, and daily necessity all pointed to the same truth. Drink fermentation, not the well. It's tempting to imagine medieval Europe as perpetually drunk, but the reality was more nuanced. Most daily drinks were weak. Strong ale, robust wine, or potent mead were reserved for feasts, festivals, or the wealthy. The average peasant couldn't afford to stumble through a day's ploughing. Instead, he relied on beverages just strong enough to preserve safely, light enough to hydrate steadily. Children drank it without much concern. Pregnant women drank it too. Modern sensibilities might twitch at that, but in their world, it was the sensible choice. Communal life reinforced this reliance. Taverns and inns sold ale and wine not just because people liked it, but because travellers demanded something safe. Imagine walking 20 miles along muddy roads, arriving at a village inn, and being offered a mug of cloudy water. You'd refuse. Instead, innkeepers poured you ale brewed on site, wine imported from a merchant or mead when available. For locals and travellers alike, alcohol became the universal standard of refreshment, partly because it united taste with trust. Even religion acknowledged this truth. The Eucharist required wine, not water. Monks brewed vast quantities of beer not out of sheer indulgence, but because it sustained their communities safely during fasting. Churches stored casks of wine in their cellars not only for Mass but for hospitality, knowing full well that no guest would be pleased with a ladle of well water. Faith and practicality aligned. Wine symbolised the blood of Christ, but it also kept his flock alive without poisoning them. Taxes and laws reflected this importance. Authorities realised that because everyone needed ale and wine, they could tax it consistently. Brewing became regulated, standards enforced, and quality monitored not just for taste but for safety. Bad ale wasn't just a disappointment, it was a potential health hazard. Officials posted ale tasters in many towns, men whose literal job was to taste batches and make sure they weren't spoiled or overly diluted. It was one of the earliest forms of consumer protection, centuries before FDA labels. Still, water never vanished completely. Rural families sometimes relied on springs or rivers, especially when they knew the sources were clean. Monasteries often built elaborate systems to filter or channel water into cloisters, both for practical and spiritual cleansing. Bathhouses required it, kitchens used it, and animals drank it. But for daily human hydration, water sat firmly in second place. There's a wry irony here. In our world, drinking water is the epitome of health, and alcohol is often flagged as the opposite. But for medieval people, the categories reversed. To drink water was to risk disease. To drink ale or wine was to take care of yourself. If you time-travelled back and ordered only water in a tavern, people might stare at you like you just requested to lick the mud off your boots. The safety of fermented drinks also carried military consequences. Armies on the march needed steady supplies of ale or wine. Campaign records from the 100 Years' War, for example, list vast quantities of wine shipped alongside weapons and armour. Commanders knew soldiers deprived of safe drink would fall sick faster than they fell in battle. Supplying booze wasn't about keeping morale up, it was about keeping stomachs intact. Mead sometimes filled this role in northern campaigns, though less often due to scarcity. Either way, armies marched not only on their stomachs but on their kegs. Even in famine years when grain ran short, peasants tried to keep brewing something, even if weak. Better a thin ale than raw water. Communities improvised with herbs, chestnuts, or other fermentables to stretch supplies. The effort reveals how deeply they trusted fermentation. It wasn't about drunkenness, it was about survival through liquid safety. So when you picture a medieval town, don't just see dirty streets, market stalls, and stone churches. Picture the endless churn of brewing pots, the smell of malt drifting through alleys, and mugs clutched in calloused hands not because people wanted to party, but because they wanted to live. Every sip of ale, every swallow of wine, every mouthful of mead was an act of self-preservation, a tiny shield against the dangers lurking in untreated water. And next time you pour yourself a glass of wine or beer in the modern world, with clean tap water at your side, remember this reversal. You have the luxury of choice, they did not. For medieval people, the safety of fermentation wasn't indulgence, it was life itself, quietly bubbling away in barrels and vats, saving millions one sip at a time. The banquet hall glows with torchlight, tapestries swaying gently in the smoky air, and the long wooden tables groan under the weight of trenchers, roasted meats, spiced sauces, and, of course, barrels of drink. Ale flows into tankards, wine into goblets, and sweet mead into ceremonial horns. The noise is deafening. Laughter, the clash of knives on platters, the thump of fists on tables as guests demand more. If you want to understand how ale, wine, and mead shaped the medieval world, you have to picture scenes like this. Because these drinks were never only about hydration or safety. They were also the architecture of celebration, the very glue that held together feasts, ceremonies, and politics. In short, no medieval event worth remembering was complete without rivers of alcohol. Think about the medieval calendar. It was stuffed with feast days, religious festivals, saints' commemorations, seasonal harvest celebrations, and of course, personal milestones like weddings. Each one was an excuse or perhaps a duty to throw a banquet. Feasting was how communities marked time, reinforced hierarchies and built alliances, and feasting required drink in abundance. Bread and meat might fill the stomach, but ale, wine, and mead filled the spirit. Without them, a feast was just a meal. With them, it became an event. Ale dominated village gatherings. Imagine a harvest feast in an English village. After weeks of sweat and aching backs, the community finally pulled in the last sheaf of grain. To celebrate, households pooled their resources, pigs were slaughtered, bread ovens ran non-stop, and every alewife in the village brewed as much as she could manage. Weak ale for the children, strong ale for the workers, and enough refills to last until everyone was either singing or sleeping under the table. These events weren't just about blowing off steam, they were rituals of gratitude, marking the turning of the year and reaffirming communal bonds. To drink together was to belong, and to refuse a cup was practically an insult. Wine elevated things further. At noble banquets or royal courts, wine wasn't just served, it was displayed as a symbol of wealth and refinement. Imported vintages from Bordeaux, Burgundy, or the Rhine filled cellars, ready to be brought out when guests of status arrived. Picture a wedding banquet for a French noble family. Long trestle tables draped with linen, golden goblets glittering, and servants hustling to keep the wine flowing without pause. The choice of wine was a political statement. Serving fine Bordeaux claret might underline alliances with English merchants, while Rhine wines signalled connections to German trade. Nobles used wine the way modern politicians use dinner parties, to display networks of power through carefully curated hospitality. Mead carried its own ceremonial gravitas. Though rarer, when it appeared at events like weddings or seasonal feasts, it was imbued with symbolic meaning. The honeyed sweetness tied it to fertility, prosperity, and celebration. Mead horns were often carved and decorated, making them showpieces as much as drinking vessels. To drink from a communal horn was to share in the symbolic sweetness of life, binding participants together. In Scandinavia, mead halls weren't just party spaces, they were seats of authority. Lords proved their generosity by keeping mead flowing for their retainers, reinforcing loyalty in exchange for hospitality. Refusing to drink with your lord could be interpreted as rejecting his authority. In this way, the ritual act of raising a horn was inseparable from politics. Religion too leaned heavily on alcohol in ceremonies. Beyond the Eucharist, which sanctified wine as Christ's blood, the church calendar overflowed with feast days where drinking was expected. Monasteries brewed strong ale for Christmas or Easter celebrations, and parish festivals often revolved around shared casks. Pilgrimages to holy sites frequently ended with communal feasting, where ale and wine turned spiritual journeys into social events. Even funerals often included drinking rituals. The funeral ale was a common tradition in parts of Europe, where mourners gathered to toast the deceased. Alcohol softened grief, but it also reminded the living of their own bonds, keeping communities tight even in loss. Drinking also fueled politics more directly. Medieval diplomacy often happened around banquet tables, where negotiators toasted peace treaties and cemented marriages with shared cups. Kings and nobles understood that alcohol loosened tongues, warmed hearts, and smoothed over tensions. Chronicles record scenes where emissaries were plied with wine until they promised favourable terms, or, in less flattering accounts, tricked into agreements they regretted once sober. The act of drinking together carried weight. To share a cup was to share trust, even if the trust was temporary. Of course, not every feast ended harmoniously. With enough ale and wine, tempers flared as easily as laughter. Brawls sometimes broke out in great halls, and chroniclers delighted in recounting stories of noble guests behaving disgracefully under the influence. Yet even these mishaps reinforced the importance of drink. People expected feasts to be rowdy. A quiet, sober banquet would have been judged a failure. The chaos was part of the ritual. Feasts also showcased the scale of medieval production. Consider the coronation of a king. Chroniclers often bragged about how many barrels of wine were consumed, how many hogsheads of ale were drained, how many horns of mead were passed around. These weren't just details, they were proof of wealth and power. To provide endless drink was to show that you controlled vast resources, from vineyards abroad to barley fields at home. It was conspicuous consumption on a massive scale. Even commoners recognised this symbolism. At village festivals, the host who provided the most ale gained respect. In towns, guilds funded banquets with free-flowing beer or wine to prove their prosperity. Generosity through drink was a core cultural value. The idea was simple. A good lord, a good guild, or a good host never let your cup run dry. Entertainment was bound up in all this. Drinking songs, storytelling, and games relied on alcohol to spark energy. A wandering minstrel with a lute could turn a crowd wild if enough ale had already flowed. Mead and wine fueled storytelling in sagas, where boasting and oath-making were expected rituals once the drinking started. A warrior's worth was measured not only in battle, but also in how boldly he boasted after a few horns of mead. This wasn't just drunkenness, it was a social script. Alcohol even shaped architecture. Great halls were built with feasts in mind, designed to hold hundreds of guests with long tables and central hearths. Taverns and inns often reserved their largest rooms for group drinking. Even village greens sometimes served as outdoor banquet spaces during major festivals, with barrels rolled out for communal use. The scale of drinking wasn't a side detail. It was baked into the very structures of medieval life. If you squint, you can almost see the continuity between then and now. Modern weddings still feature champagne toasts. Political summits still include dinners where wine flows freely. Family holidays still rely on the ritual of raising a glass together. Medieval people didn't invent communal drinking, but they codified it in ways that shaped Western culture for centuries. So, when you picture medieval Europe, don't just see grimy streets, armoured knights, and peasants in muddy fields. Picture the other side: roaring banquets, golden goblets, mead horns flashing in firelight, and endless mugs of ale passed from hand to hand. Picture how much weight a single drink could carry, marking a marriage, sealing a treaty, honouring a saint, or grieving a loss. In those moments, ale, wine, and mead weren't just beverages. They were the essence of togetherness, the ritual that turned meals into milestones and strangers into companions. And in a world where life was often short, uncertain, and brutal, perhaps that was their greatest gift: the chance to pause, raise a cup, and remember that, for at least one evening, you belong to something larger than yourself. The door creaks as you push it open, and you step into a low-roofed room lit by a smoky fire and a scattering of tallow candles. The air smells of wet wool, wood smoke, roasted onions, and that unmistakable yeasty tang of freshly poured ale. Voices rise in a jumble, farmers haggling over sheep, merchants boasting about their travels, a fiddler trying to tune his instrument while being heckled by friends. You've entered a medieval tavern, one of the most important social and economic spaces in the entire period. Taverns, inns, and alehouses weren't just about drinking. They were about community, politics, trade, and survival. In fact, if you wanted to understand the heartbeat of medieval society, you'd do well to spend a few evenings in places like these. Taverns first grew out of necessity. As towns expanded, not every household could brew enough ale for itself. Urban density made private brewing less practical, and merchants travelling from one town to another needed places to rest, eat, and of course, drink. Alewives sold extra batches from their homes, gradually transforming simple domestic brewing into semi-public businesses. Soon, local authorities stepped in with regulations. If you wanted to sell ale, you needed permission, and once you had it, you were effectively running a proto-pub. By the 13th century, almost every town and many villages had designated alehouses or taverns. These places became social magnets. Villagers gathered at alehouses to discuss local gossip, arrange marriages, or hash out disputes. Townsfolk used taverns as meeting spots for guilds, where business deals were hammered out over mugs of frothy drink. Inns along major roads provided travellers with a bed, a meal, and a jug. serving as the medieval equivalent of both a rest stop and a networking hub. For many, taverns were the only public indoor spaces where ordinary people could gather freely without being under the direct authority of church or lord. Alcohol fueled these interactions. A pint of ale or a goblet of wine softened tensions and loosened tongues. Disputes settled faster, jokes landed harder, and friendships grew stronger. People didn't just go to taverns to drink. They went to connect. In an age when most of life was bound by the rigid routines of farm work, guild duties or religious obligations, the tavern was a release valve, a space where laughter, music, and conversation flowed as freely as the ale. Of course, taverns also attracted scrutiny. Authorities worried about disorder, drunkenness, and subversion. That's why ale tasters and wine inspectors roamed cities, checking quality and enforcing fair measures. Watering down ale or overcharging for wine could land you in trouble. But despite official suspicion, governments also recognised taverns as crucial for tax revenue. Licensing fees, drink duties, and fines on tavern owners became reliable sources of income. In a sense, taverns were tolerated not only because people loved them, but because rulers profited from them. The atmosphere inside varied depending on class and region. In an English alehouse, you might find peasants sharing cloudy small ale in rough wooden cups. In a Parisian tavern, wealthy merchants ordered imported wines in pewter goblets while debating politics. In a Baltic inn, mead flowed alongside foreign beer brought by Hanseatic traders. What united them all was the sense of shared experience. Drinking wasn't solitary, it was communal. Songs, riddles, and games were standard entertainment. Dice and cards clattered across tables, sometimes leading to fortunes won and lost in a single night. Minstrels, poets, and jugglers often performed in taverns, supported by tips or drinks from the crowd. But taverns weren't only about merriment, they were centres of serious business. Merchant deals were sealed in taverns, as were political conspiracies. Chroniclers record secret plots hatched over ale in smoky back rooms. Rebellions, uprisings, and guild strikes often began with whispered words exchanged over mugs. Authorities knew this, which is why taverns were sometimes raided or monitored. They weren't just drinking spots. They were hotbeds of potential dissent. You could argue that some revolutions were born not in palaces or churches, but in taverns. For travellers, inns provided a lifeline. Picture trudging along a muddy road in winter, freezing rain soaking your cloak, wolves howling in the distance. The warm glow of an inn on the horizon was salvation. Inside you'd find a fire, a straw mattress, and a jug of ale. Inns became critical nodes in the network of medieval travel. Pilgrims on their way to Canterbury, Santiago, or Rome relied on them. Merchants carrying goods across Europe planned routes according to where inns stood. Kings and armies requisitioned them during campaigns, filling their cellars with soldiers instead of pilgrims. Without inns and taverns, long-distance travel would have been nearly impossible. Mead often played a ceremonial role in these spaces, even if it wasn't the daily drink of choice. A wedding feast at an inn might feature mead for the bridal couple, while the rest of the guests drank ale or wine. Mead horns, polished and decorated, carried symbolic weight, and their presence in taverns reminded patrons of the old traditions that tied drinking to loyalty and community. In Northern Europe especially, inns doubled as mead halls, echoing the ancient sagas where warriors pledged oaths and celebrated victories with honey-gold drink. Women were deeply tied to tavern culture too. Many tavern keepers and alewives were women, continuing the tradition of domestic brewing but turning it into profitable enterprise. Some gained reputations for hospitality and good drink, while others were accused of cheating customers. Satirical literature often portrayed alewives as greedy or bawdy, but in reality they provided one of the few independent business opportunities available to women in medieval society. Running a tavern or alehouse could bring respect, income, and influence, along with plenty of gossip. Taverns also shaped legal culture. Courts sometimes met in taverns, using them as neutral grounds. Juries and local councils adjourned there for meals while deliberating. The phrase ale bench justice wasn't always flattering, but it reflected the reality that taverns served as extensions of public life. Even coroners held inquests over bodies while sipping ale in taverns. Imagine being summoned to answer for a crime while the judge drinks a mug in front of you. justice with a foam moustache. Not surprisingly, taverns drew criticism from moralists and church authorities. Preachers railed against drunkenness, gambling, and licentious behaviour. Caricatures of tavern life painted it as a den of sin, where men squandered wages and women lost virtue. Yet even those critics often found themselves drinking in taverns after sermons. The hypocrisy was as thick as the ale. In truth, taverns were too essential to banish. They were woven into the fabric of daily life, and attempts to close them only drove drinkers to private spaces where authorities had even less control. The diversity of taverns was remarkable. Some catered to elites, offering imported wines and refined meals. Others were rough shacks serving only the cheapest ale to labourers. Urban taverns bustled with merchants and clerks, while rural alehouses provided cosy gathering spots for scattered villagers. Inns along trade routes became melting pots of cultures, with German beer, French wine, English ale, and Scandinavian mead all clashing in the same room. The variety reflected the diversity of medieval Europe itself. Alcohol made these spaces hum. Without it, taverns would have been little more than canteens. With it, they became the pulse of society. Deals were struck, friendships forged, songs sung, and rebellions whispered into being. In every mug, whether of weak ale or robust claret, people found not just refreshment but connection. So picture yourself back in that smoky tavern. The fiddler finally finds his tune, a group of merchants argue over the price of wool, and a peasant slams his mug down in triumph after winning a round of dice. A barmaid winks as she refills your cup, and the fire crackles louder as rain lashes the shutters. You raise your mug, take a long drink, and feel yourself slip into the timeless rhythm of medieval life, where taverns weren't just places to drink, but the living, breathing centres of community, economy, and even revolution. The church bells ring across the town calling everyone to worship, and you shuffle along with the crowd into a stone nave heavy with incense. At the altar, the priest raises a chalice, the wine within catching the flicker of candlelight. For medieval people, this moment was not symbolic, it was literal. Wine became the blood of Christ. To drink it was to commune with God himself. Ale, wine, and mead weren't just everyday beverages or party fuel. They were deeply entangled with religion. Sacred rituals, monastic economies, and fierce moral debates about drinking all shaped how faith and alcohol intertwined in the medieval world. Start with the obvious. Wine was indispensable to Christianity. From the earliest days, the Eucharist required wine, echoing Christ's Last Supper. That meant every church, no matter how remote, needed a steady supply. In southern Europe, this was easy. Vineyards stretched across France, Italy, and Spain, so local priests could fill chalices with regional vintages. But in northern Europe, where grapes struggled, churches had to import wine, often at great cost. Imagine a tiny parish in England scraping funds to purchase claret from Bordeaux just to keep their mass legitimate. The demand was so absolute that even when harvests failed, rulers prioritised sacramental wine above all else. Starving peasants might go without bread, but priests still had their chalices filled. This necessity gave monasteries enormous power. As we've seen with ale, monks were master brewers, but in vineyard regions they were also master vintners. Benedictine and Cistercian orders cultivated some of Europe's most renowned vineyards, from Burgundy's Côte d'Or to the hills of Champagne. Their wine didn't just fill chalices, it filled coffers. Pilgrims flocking to monasteries often left with wine, and abbeys sold barrels to towns and nobles. Over centuries, monks refined techniques, pruning, grafting, careful harvesting. Their devotion wasn't only spiritual, it was agricultural science. To this day, some of the world's most prized vineyards trace back to monastic management. Ale and mead also had religious connections, though less central than wine. In northern monasteries, ale was consumed daily, blessed as nourishment that sustained monks through fasts. Some even argued that drinking ale during fasting didn't break the fast because it was liquid bread. Convenient, yes, but also practical. Mead occasionally played ceremonial roles in northern Christian rituals, often blended with herbs for feast days. Honey itself carried biblical symbolism, the land flowing with milk and honey. so fermented honey water could be framed as a gift from God. But religion's relationship with alcohol was never simple. On one hand, the Church sanctified it. On the other, it condemned excess. Preachers railed against drunkenness as a gateway to sin, gluttony, lust, sloth, even violence. Medieval art often depicted drunkards as comic or pathetic figures, sprawled on tavern floors while devils danced around them. Church councils issued decrees limiting priests' drinking, forbidding them from showing up drunk to services. Yes, apparently that had to be spelled out. Sermons warned lay people that Satan lurked at the bottom of the cup. Yet, despite the warnings, alcohol remained central to both liturgy and daily life. The contradiction was built in. Moderate drinking was holy, drunkenness was sinful, but the line between the two was fuzzy at best. Some religious movements took a harder stance. Reformers like the Lollards in England criticised the Church's reliance on wine, pointing out the hypocrisy of priests denouncing drunkenness while guzzling expensive vintages. In more radical sects, abstinence was praised as a mark of purity. But these voices were marginal. For the majority of medieval Christians, alcohol was normal, expected and essential. Judaism and Islam also shaped the medieval alcohol landscape. Jewish communities in Europe engaged in winemaking and sometimes brewing, though rabbinic law imposed regulations. Wine was central to Jewish ritual, especially Sabbath and Passover, making Jewish vintners important suppliers even to Christians. Meanwhile, in Islamic territories like Al-Andalus, alcohol was officially prohibited, yet production and consumption persisted quietly. Muslim physicians wrote extensively about wine's medical uses, and Christian travellers often noted with a smirk that Muslim elites sometimes ignored the prohibition in private. The tension between religious law and daily reality was a recurring theme across faiths. The symbolic power of alcohol in religion extended to stories and miracles. Hagiographies, the biographies of saints, often included episodes involving drink. One saint miraculously refilled empty wine barrels for the poor. Another purified poisoned ale with a blessing. These tales reinforced the idea that alcohol was not inherently sinful. It could even be divine when tied to virtue. Monks brewed, priests blessed, saints multiplied. To live in medieval Europe was to live in a culture where God himself seemed to endorse fermentation. Still, anxieties persisted. The line between celebration and sin could blur quickly. Think of church festivals. A saint's day might begin with solemn mass, then spill into processions, then into feasts, then into drunken revelry in the village square. Priests often complained that their congregations treated holy days as excuses for binge drinking, yet they rarely banned the festivals outright. Alcoholic celebration was too embedded in the social fabric. It was easier to wag a finger in a sermon than to fight against centuries of tradition. Alcohol also crept into monastic disputes. Some reforming orders criticised others for overindulgence. The Cistercians, for example, originally emphasised austerity, claiming their Benedictine cousins lived too richly with fine wines and strong ales. Yet even the Cistercians eventually caved, managing sprawling vineyards and brewing hearty beers. Poverty vows and practical survival rarely stayed in harmony. Even death was tied to alcohol. Funeral feasts known as ale in some regions featured communal drinking in honour of the deceased. It wasn't enough to bury someone, you had to toast them too. This practice scandalised some clerics, who worried that mourning turned too easily into drunken debauchery. Still, the tradition endured, showing how deeply alcohol was woven into both sacred and secular rites of passage. At its heart, religion and alcohol in the Middle Ages were bound together by paradox. Alcohol was sacred yet sinful, life-giving yet dangerous, communal yet corrupting. The Church relied on it for its holiest ritual while warning against it from the pulpit. Monks brewed barrels while preaching moderation. Parishioners toasted saints and sinned in the same swallow. The contradiction was never fully resolved, but perhaps that was the point. Medieval life thrived on paradox, and alcohol embodied it perfectly. So picture that priest again at the altar raising the chalice high. For the congregation, the wine in that cup wasn't just drink. It was salvation, holiness and tradition. Later, those same parishioners would leave church, head to the tavern, and raise mugs of ale in the same motion. Sacred and profane blurred, as they always did, and fermentation carried them from prayer to laughter, from ritual to riot. In the medieval world, religion didn't just tolerate alcohol, it depended on it, even while nervously watching it overflow. The smell hits you first when you step into a medieval apothecary. Sharp herbs hanging from rafters, dried roots in bundles, and a faint tang of wine spiked with resin. A mortar thumps rhythmically as an apprentice pounds ingredients, while on a shelf nearby glass vessels hold liquids in shades of red, amber, and gold. This isn't a tavern, but the same drinks you'd find at the table, ale, wine, and mead, are also sitting here, labelled as medicine. In the medieval world, alcohol wasn't only about thirst, celebration, or religion. It was an indispensable tool of healing, prescribed by physicians, trusted by midwives, and consumed by patients who believed in its power to rebalance the humours and chase away illness. Galenic medicine dominated European thought for centuries, teaching that health depended on balancing the four humours: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Everything you consumed, from bread to broth, was thought to shift those humours. Wine, ale, and mead were no exception. Doctors classified wines by qualities: hot, cold, moist, or dry, and prescribed them accordingly. Red wines were considered warming and good for digestion, especially in colder climates. White wines, being lighter, were thought more suitable for fevers or delicate stomachs. Strong wine was advised for the elderly to warm the blood, while watered wine suited the young. Ale, by contrast, was usually labelled cold and moist, nourishing but prone to producing phlegm. Mead, with its honey base, was often praised as warming and restorative, especially when infused with herbs. Medical recipes routinely called for these drinks. A 13th century English leech book medical manual included dozens of cures mixing wine with herbs like sage, rosemary, or fennel. A stomachache? Drink spiced wine. A wound? Wash it with warmed wine to clean infection. A cough? Sip mead with thyme. Women in labour were sometimes given ale with eggs beaten into it for strength. Soldiers wounded in battle had their gashes rinsed with wine, which, though the doctors didn't know it, actually worked fairly well as an antiseptic compared to stagnant water. Long before germ theory, people observed that wine-washed wounds fared better. Ale in particular played a huge role in daily health simply by providing nutrition. Physicians acknowledged that it was liquid bread, full of strength for peasants who worked long hours in the fields. Weak ale, consumed in large quantities, kept people hydrated, but it also provided calories, vitamins from the grains, and even trace minerals. For children, old people, or the sick, a mug of small ale could mean the difference between surviving and wasting away. Doctors might complain that ale caused sluggishness or bloating, but they could hardly deny its necessity. Mead often straddled the line between medicine and luxury. Herbal meads, sometimes called metheglins in later centuries, were especially prized for their curative qualities. Honey itself was already recognised as a healing substance, used to dress wounds and soothe throats. Ferment it, and you created a drink that not only healed but comforted. Recipes survive that call for mead boiled with rosemary for memory, or with cloves and cinnamon for stomach troubles. Apothecaries stocked jars of mead for clients wealthy enough to afford honey's high price. For poorer patients, ale with local herbs filled the same role. Wine, though, was the undisputed star of medieval medicine. Medical treatises praised its ability to thin the blood, cleanse the stomach, and carry the virtues of herbs deep into the body. Infusions were common: wormwood wine for digestion, sage wine for sore throats, rose wine for melancholy. Physicians also recommended mulled wine, heated with spices, not just for flavour but for therapeutic warmth. Spiced wines like Hippocras were staples at courts and apothecaries alike, bridging the gap between medicine and indulgence. In fact, many noble banquets doubled as pharmacies, with dishes and drinks prepared according to humoral principles to keep diners balanced. Alcohol also served as a preservative. Herbs steeped in wine lasted longer, meaning remedies could be stored and transported more easily. This made alcoholic tinctures one of the most practical forms of medicine in an age without refrigeration. Monasteries, with their breweries and vineyards, often doubled as hospitals, producing medicated wines and ales for both their communities and travellers. Some abbeys became famous for specific recipes, their herbal wines shipped to towns far beyond their walls. These were early pharmaceutical brands blending faith, science and fermentation. Childbirth offers another glimpse into alcohol's medical role. Labour was dangerous, and midwives relied on whatever tools they had. Ale mixed with eggs or honey might be given to strengthen the mother. Wine, warmed and spiced, was used to ease pain or revive fainting women. After birth, mothers were sometimes given mead to restore energy, while newborns were occasionally dabbed with wine on lips or gums as both disinfectant and welcome. Again, while modern eyes might balk, in their world fermentation meant safety. Better to soothe with wine than risk contaminated water. Alcohol also acted as a crude anaesthetic. Surgeons performing painful procedures, setting bones, pulling teeth, or even amputating limbs, sometimes gave patients strong wine or ale beforehand to dull the senses. Combined with opiates or mandrake root, alcohol helped patients endure what otherwise would have been unbearable. Accounts from battlefield surgery mention soldiers being given copious draughts of wine before being cut. It didn't erase pain, but it dulled it enough to make survival possible. Not everyone approved, of course. Critics pointed out that too much reliance on alcohol could itself create illness. Chronic drunkenness was associated with gout, swollen bellies, and moral corruption. Some doctors warned against wine's heating properties, claiming it stirred up lust or anger. Others frowned on ale for making people sluggish. Yet, even in their warnings, they rarely suggested total abstinence. The benefits far outweighed the risks. Moderation was the mantra, though what counted as moderate in a world where daily consumption reached several litres is another question entirely. The availability of alcohol as medicine also revealed class divisions. Rich patients received fine wines imported from Gascony or Italy, infused with costly spices like cinnamon or nutmeg. Poorer patients got local ale with garden herbs or foraged plants. Mead was mostly reserved for those who could afford honey. Thus, even in sickness your class determined what you drank. A wealthy merchant might sip hippocras from silver, while a peasant swallowed bitter ale steeped with sage. Both believed they were taking medicine, but the experience and the taste was worlds apart. Alcohol's place in medicine extended beyond Europe. Arab physicians like Avicenna and Rhazes wrote extensively about wine's therapeutic uses, even as Islamic law prohibited drinking. Their works, translated into Latin, influenced European medicine profoundly. From them, Europeans adopted new ways of distilling and preserving remedies in alcohol, paving the way for stronger medicinal extracts in later centuries. By the late Middle Ages, distillation techniques were spreading, producing stronger aqua vitae, water of life, that blurred the line between medicine and liquor. These spirits would eventually eclipse mead and ale in medical use, but in the medieval period, the gentler fermentation still dominated. Imagine yourself back in that apothecary. A man hobbles in with a stomachache. The apothecary listens, nods, and prescribes a cup of wormwood wine to settle the humours. A woman brings her coughing child, and he prepares a syrup of honey, thyme, and weak ale. A soldier, scarred and limping, receives strong red wine to cleanse his wounds. Each treatment draws from the same well. Alcohol, transformed from simple drink into a trusted cure. For medieval people, there was no clear boundary between food, drink, and medicine. Everything you consumed had the potential to heal or harm. Ale, wine, and mead embodied that duality perfectly. They nourished, they comforted, they disinfected, they dulled pain. They could also intoxicate, inflame, or weaken. But in a world of limited options, they were indispensable. Without them, medieval medicine would have been crippled, and survival even harder than it already was. So the next time you sip mulled wine at Christmas or reach for a spoon of honey when you're sick, remember, you're echoing centuries of medieval practice, when ale, wine, and mead weren't just drinks, but remedies, brewed into the very fabric of healing. The hearthfire smoulders in a peasant cottage, and a woman bends over a steaming pot, stirring carefully with a long wooden paddle. The smell of malted grain fills the air, mingling with smoke and damp earth. Children play at her feet while she hums softly, glancing at the bubbling liquid. She isn't just making supper, she's brewing ale, the daily fuel of her household, and, for many centuries, the responsibility of women. To understand the history of alcohol in the medieval world, you have to place women squarely at the centre. They brewed it, sold it, and shaped its culture, until gradually men and institutions muscled them aside. For most of the early and high Middle Ages, brewing was a domestic duty. Just as women baked bread, they brewed ale. The parallels were obvious. Both required grain, heat, and fermentation. Ale was liquid bread, and making it was part of a woman's contribution to household survival. Every few days, ale had to be brewed fresh, because it spoiled quickly. That meant endless cycles of soaking, malting, boiling and fermenting, labour-intensive but as essential as keeping the hearth lit. Without women's constant brewing, families would have gone thirsty, and communities would have lost their primary source of safe hydration. But brewing wasn't confined to private consumption. Whenever a household produced more than it could drink, women sold the surplus to neighbours. Over time, this practice gave rise to professional alewives. These women set up shops or sold directly from their homes, hanging a broom or a bush outside the door as a sign of fresh ale. Villagers knew where to find the best brew, and alewives gained reputations, some for quality, others for cheating. In many communities, the alewife was as recognisable a figure as the blacksmith or the miller. Alewives occupied a curious social position. On the one hand, they were respected as providers of a vital commodity. On the other, they were targets of suspicion. Authorities often accused them of watering down ale using inferior grains, or shortchanging customers with false measures. The stereotype of the dishonest alewife became common in medieval satire and morality plays. Artists painted them as greedy, loud, or sexually immoral. Yet the reality was more complex. Most alewives were simply women running small businesses to support their families, working within the constraints of a patriarchal society. The smear campaigns reflected not only concerns about fraud, but also unease with women gaining economic independence. Records show just how central women were. In 14th century English towns, the majority of licensed brewers were women. Court rolls are filled with fines levied against alewives for selling bad ale, overcharging, or brewing without permission. These fines might sound punitive, but in practice they were part of a system. Alewives paid small penalties regularly, essentially functioning as a form of taxation. Local governments recognised that they couldn't eliminate women from brewing, they depended on them too much. Instead, they regulated them, keeping a steady flow of income from their work. Brewing also gave women visibility in public life. In markets, taverns and fairs, they sold their ale directly, interacting with men outside their households in ways that many other occupations didn't permit. Some alewives became well-known figures, central to community gossip and news. In literature, they often appeared as comic stock characters, but behind the satire lay the truth. Women brewers were everywhere, and everyone depended on them. The gender dynamics began to shift in the later Middle Ages. As brewing scaled up from household to industry, men increasingly took control. Monasteries brewed on a massive scale, supplying towns with consistent, regulated ale. Urban guilds formed, dominated by men, who argued that brewing required professional oversight beyond women's domestic work. The introduction of hopped beer in the 14th and 15th centuries accelerated this shift. Hops extended shelf life, allowing for larger batches and wider trade. Brewing transformed from small perishable production to commercial enterprise, and as soon as serious profit entered the picture, women were pushed aside. Alewives faced growing hostility. Authorities cracked down harder on unlicensed brewing, guilds excluded women, and cultural attacks intensified. By the early modern period, the image of the alewife had merged with another figure, the witch. Brooms hanging outside houses, cauldrons bubbling with mysterious brews, cats prowling around, all were features of female brewers that slid easily into witch stereotypes. It's no coincidence that accusations of witchcraft often targeted women who had once brewed or sold ale. The economic independence of brewing had made them threatening, and the cultural backlash was vicious. Still, in the medieval period itself, women remained indispensable. In rural areas especially, they never stopped brewing for their families. Even when monasteries and guilds dominated towns, households still relied on female labour for their daily drink. Alewives also persisted, dodging regulations and paying fines when caught. Some even thrived, building reputations that outlasted attempts to marginalise them. Mead and wine saw less female involvement, mostly because of their production methods. Beekeeping was often a male-dominated task, tied to landholding and labour-intensive hive management. Vineyard work too fell largely to men, especially once monastic and noble estates took control. But women still appeared at the margins, helping press grapes, selling honey, or preparing spiced wines in kitchens. Their most visible and independent role, however, remained in ale brewing, where their skills and labour sustained entire communities. The cultural anxiety surrounding female brewers reveals much about gender in the medieval world. Men feared women's control of such a vital resource, and they mocked or demonised them to reassert dominance. Yet, no satire, regulation, or guild exclusion could erase the fact that women brewed the drink that kept everyone alive. Their hands stirred the mash, measured the herbs, and poured the mugs that nourished families and neighbours. Behind every medieval man's boast in a tavern was a woman's labour at the hearth. Imagine again that cottage scene. The alewife stirs the pot, her face lit by firelight, while outside a neighbour knocks to ask if the latest batch is ready. She pours him a cup, accepts a few pennies, and watches as he takes a grateful sip. He doesn't think about her reputation, or guilds, or taxes. He just knows the ale is good, and he'll be back tomorrow. Multiply that by thousands of villages across Europe, and you see the truth. Women were the unsung brewers of medieval life, their labour woven into every mug of ale drunk from peasant huts to noble halls. So while monks and merchants may have shaped the grand story of brewing, the everyday reality was this: women brewed the Middle Ages. And though their role was gradually overshadowed by institutions and industries, their legacy lingers every time we lift a glass of beer today. Picture a bustling medieval marketplace, where the smell of fish mingles with spices and the chatter of buyers and sellers fills the air. Among the stalls of cloth, bread and meat, one thing always stands out: barrels of ale, casks of wine, and the occasional jug of mead. These drinks weren't only food and pleasure, they were law and revenue. The regulation of alcohol, from taxes to punishments, shaped daily life in ways both subtle and blunt. If ale, wine, and mead were the bloodstream of medieval Europe, law and taxation were the veins that channeled them. Let's start with taxes, because governments figured out quickly that where there was drink, there was money. Brewing and selling alcohol was nearly universal, which made it the perfect target for consistent taxation. In England, for example, the assize of ale was a set of regulations that dictated the quality, price, and measurement of ale. First issued in the 13th century, it ensured that brewers didn't overcharge or cheat customers, but more importantly, it created a legal framework for fines and levies. Ale conners, official tasters, were appointed in towns to sample batches and confirm their quality. Imagine being paid to walk around town drinking ale all day. A dream job, yes, but with a serious purpose. If the ale was weak, sour, or overpriced, the brewer was fined. The money went straight into the town's coffers. Wine, being more prestigious and often imported, was taxed heavily at ports. English kings grew especially reliant on duties from Bordeaux Claret, which flowed in vast quantities during the 13th and 14th centuries. Customs officers recorded shipments in painstaking detail, ensuring that every barrel contributed to royal revenue. The profits were staggering. During the 100 Years' War, English rulers essentially financed campaigns against France by taxing French wine imported into London. War fueled by wine. It almost sounds like a medieval joke, except it was deadly serious. Mead was less central to taxation simply because it was rarer. Honey production couldn't match the scale of grain or vineyards. Still, in regions where mead was popular, like Scandinavia or parts of Eastern Europe, it too was subject to levies. Monasteries with large apiaries often paid portions of their honey or mead directly as tithe. Even the bees weren't safe from the taxman. Regulation wasn't just about money, it was about control. Authorities worried constantly about disorder, and taverns were prime hotspots for trouble. That's why laws dictated when and where alcohol could be sold. In many towns, alehouses had to close during church services, and selling after curfew could bring punishment. Drunkenness itself wasn't always illegal, but public misbehaviour caused by it was. A brawl in a tavern could land participants in the stocks or even in prison. Chronic offenders were shamed in church, fined, or in extreme cases banished from towns. The regulation of women brewers reveals another layer of control. Alewives were often fined disproportionately, accused of cheating customers or selling short measure. These charges, while sometimes justified, also reflected broader suspicion of women's independence. Guilds controlled by men pushed for stricter oversight, using the law to squeeze women out of brewing. In this way, taxation and regulation weren't neutral. They actively shaped gender roles in brewing and commerce. Punishments could be harsh, especially when fraud was involved. Selling bad ale or wine wasn't just an economic crime, it was considered a moral failing. Authorities argued that it endangered public health and violated trust. In some towns, fraudulent brewers were paraded through the streets with their bad ale dumped over their heads. Others were forced to drink their own spoiled product as public humiliation. The idea was clear. Brewing wasn't just business, it was a public duty, and betraying that duty warranted shame. Drinking laws also reflected religious influence. During Lent and other fasting periods, authorities sometimes restricted the sale of stronger ales or wines, though enforcement varied. Pilgrimages and feast days, by contrast, saw regulations loosened to accommodate mass celebrations. Local rulers recognised that trying to curb drinking during festivals was futile. Better to channel it, tax it, and supervise it. One of the most fascinating aspects of alcohol law was its role in measuring currency and value. A penny ale wasn't just a drink, it was a unit of exchange, linking the price of ale to daily wages and food costs. Governments often used ale prices as benchmarks for economic health. If ale grew too expensive, riots could break out since it was a basic necessity. Thus, rulers tried to keep it affordable, even subsidising production in hard times. You can measure just how important ale was by the fact that kings worried about its price as much as about bread. Wine had its own set of regulations. In France, certain vineyards received royal protection, forbidding imports that might undercut them. Burgundy, for instance, became fiercely protective of its vintages, banning inferior wines from being sold alongside them. These laws weren't only about taste, they were about prestige and revenue. By elevating specific wines legally, rulers could boost regional economies and strengthen their own political base. Alcohol also intersected with military law. Soldiers on campaign received daily rations of ale or wine, often specified in contracts. Failing to supply them could lead to mutiny, so commanders enforced strict rules about distribution. Tavern keepers near garrisons were required to sell at set prices to prevent gouging. Armies even had inspectors to check that barrels weren't watered down. In war as in peace, alcohol laws aimed to keep order, maintain morale, and prevent exploitation. Of course, enforcement wasn't perfect. Smuggling was rampant. Merchants sneaked untaxed wine into ports, and villagers brewed illicit ale in back rooms. Authorities chased down offenders, but demand was too high to suppress. In many ways, medieval bootleggers echoed later prohibition smugglers, driven by profit, hated by officials, but loved by thirsty neighbours. Laws could bend, but the thirst for ale, wine, and mead never disappeared. The symbolism of alcohol in law is also worth noting. Alehouse became shorthand for moral danger in sermons and statutes alike. Lawmakers described taverns as breeding grounds for sin, lumping them together with gambling dens and brothels, yet those same lawmakers drank in them. The contradiction was glaring. Society condemned excess, but it legislated around alcohol precisely because it was indispensable. You couldn't outlaw what everyone needed, so you controlled it instead. Imagine again that marketplace. An alewife nervously watches as the aleconner dips a ladle into her barrel, sips, and nods in approval. She breathes a sigh of relief. No fine today. Across town, a customs officer counts Bordeaux casks off a ship, tallying up taxes for the crown. In the tavern, a constable warns drinkers to quiet down before curfew. Everywhere you look, alcohol isn't just being consumed, it's being regulated, measured and monetised. The legal and fiscal structures around ale, wine and mead remind us of their centrality. Governments didn't bother taxing luxuries that only a few enjoyed. They taxed what everyone needed. They regulated what shaped daily life. That's why alcohol, more than almost any other commodity, became the backbone of medieval legal systems. It wasn't just about raising a mug, it was about raising revenue, enforcing order, and projecting authority into every corner of society. So the next time you hear a toast, imagine the medieval bureaucracy lurking behind it. Tasters, inspectors, tax collectors, constables, all ensuring that your cup of ale or wine did more than quench your thirst. It also filled the coffers, kept the peace, and reminded you that in the medieval world, even pleasure had a price. Imagine sitting at a long wooden table in a draughty medieval hall. The servants shuffle past with trenchers piled high with meat for the lord and his guests, while at the far end, peasants and servants receive scraps and thinner ale. The division is plain in what everyone holds in their cups. Alcohol didn't just quench thirst, it drew the clearest lines between medieval classes. What you drank, how strong it was, and the vessel it came in spoke volumes about who you were in the social order. Ale, wine, and mead-shaped class distinctions as surely as clothing, castles, or land ownership. Start with peasants. For them, ale was life. Weak small ale fueled their days, consumed with every meal, from breakfast bread dipped into mugs to suppers of pottage washed down with cloudy drink. The strength of ale they drank was rarely more than 2 or 3% alcohol, but it carried calories, minerals, and safety. Stronger brews were reserved for festivals like harvest feasts or weddings, when neighbours pooled resources. Wine was largely out of reach. Imported Bordeaux or Burgundy cost more than a peasant's weekly wages, and local vineyards, if they existed, served monasteries or nobles first. Mead too was rare. Honey was too valuable to waste on common folk. For peasants, ale defined their status. Reliable, nourishing but humble, brewed and drunk from rough wooden or pottery mugs. The middling classes, artisans, tradesmen, prosperous farmers, sat in a different position. They had access to better ale, sometimes stronger or flavoured with herbs, and occasionally they could afford local wines. In towns, prosperous merchants enjoyed imported wines at guild banquets, though rarely the best vintages. They were also among the first to embrace hopped beer from Germany and the Low Countries, appreciating its longer shelf life and suitability for trade. Drinking in taverns became part of their culture, where status was measured by the price and quality of what you ordered. For these people, alcohol wasn't just sustenance, it was a marker of upward mobility, a way of signalling success. Nobles and royalty, by contrast, lived in a world soaked with wine. Their feasts overflowed with imported claret, sweet malmsey from Crete, or fine Rhine vintages. To serve wine at every course was to declare wealth and connection. Nobles didn't just drink wine, they displayed it in goblets of silver or crystal, poured by servants as part of elaborate rituals. The very act of holding a jewelled goblet signalled status. Mead also found a place at elite tables, especially in northern courts, where it was tied to tradition and prestige. A lord who offered mead in polished horns wasn't just quenching thirst, he was showing generosity and linking himself to heroic traditions from sagas and epics. Nobles occasionally drank ale too, but only the best, brewed strong, clear and spiced. They treated it more like a delicacy than a daily staple. Religious communities bridged these divides in unique ways. Monks brewed ale that rivaled or surpassed noble quality, but they consumed it daily as sustenance. Pilgrims and the poor received weaker versions as charity, while stronger brews were reserved for feast days or honoured guests. In monasteries, class differences existed even within the cloister. Choir monks received better rations and stronger ale than lay brothers. Wine dominated monasteries in southern Europe, where it served both liturgical and daily purposes. But even there, quality varied depending on rank. Sacred ritual required the best wine for chalices, while weaker vintages filled the cups of lower-ranked monks. The divine didn't erase class. It reinforced it through subtle gradations in taste and quality. Even the vessels reinforced social divides. A peasant's ale was drunk from a simple wooden mug or clay cup, chipped and unadorned. Merchants might use pewter, a step up but still modest. Nobles sipped from silver, gold, or Venetian glass imported at great expense. Drinking vessels were display pieces, meant to be admired as much as used. Chronicles describe kings showing off jewel-encrusted goblets at feasts, their glitter reinforcing the majesty of the court. What was in the cup mattered, but the cup itself mattered almost as much. Alcohol also reinforced hierarchies at public events. At village feasts, everyone drank ale, but the lord's household drank the stronger first run, while tenants and labourers drank the weaker second or third. At royal banquets, nobles toasted with fine wine while servants sipped leftovers. The seating arrangement, the strength of drink, and the sequence of serving all underscored the ladder of privilege. Everyone drank, but not equally. Symbolism ran deep. Ale became associated with the common man, earthy and practical. Wine symbolized refinement, nobility, and sacred ritual. Mead carried connotations of myth, poetry, and ceremonial generosity. These associations weren't just stereotypes, they shaped behaviour. A noble who stooped to drink small ale might be mocked as miserly. A peasant who somehow got hold of fine wine might be resented as presumptuous. Alcohol wasn't only consumed, it was performed, each sip declaring social identity. The class divide even shaped intoxication. Nobles could afford to drink wine to excess, but drunkenness risked their dignity, so etiquette manuals warned them to keep composure. Peasants, on the other hand, often drank ale in communal bursts at festivals, where rowdiness was expected and tolerated. The right way to get drunk depended on who you were. For nobles, a red face was a scandal. For peasants, it was part of the party. Guilds and professional groups added another layer. Guild feasts featured drinking as central ritual, with members toasting one another in rounds that reinforced solidarity. But even within guilds, hierarchy showed. Masters drank better wine, journeymen and apprentices stuck to ale. These rituals weren't trivial. They built loyalty and reinforced the structures of power within professions. Gender crossed into class drinking habits too. Elite women drank wine alongside men at noble tables, though often in smaller quantities to maintain decorum. Peasant women drank ale daily, as much for hydration as for pleasure, sharing the same mugs as their husbands and children. Women could be celebrated for their brewing skills in villages, but mocked if they overindulged. Class dictated what you drank. Gender dictated how you drank it. Even crime and punishment revealed class distinctions through alcohol. A noble caught drunk might be quietly reprimanded or satirized in courtly poems. A peasant caught drunk and disorderly could be fined, flogged, or locked in the stocks. The same behaviour, too much drink, carried vastly different consequences depending on rank. The law itself recognised that alcohol was universal, but its implications were unequal. Consider the battlefield too. Soldiers, drawn mostly from lower classes, were issued daily rations of ale or wine, the quality depending on the army's wealth and region. Officers, drawn from nobility, drank better vintages. The hierarchy extended even into war, where alcohol kept armies alive but also reminded each soldier of his place in the chain of command. Class differences in drink echoed through literature. In Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, the miller and the wife of Bath are tied to alehouses earthy and bawdy. The knight, in contrast, is dignified, linked to noble feasts with wine. Epic tales describe kings drinking mead in shining halls, while comic plays portray peasants stumbling home from alehouses. These depictions reinforced stereotypes, ensuring that audiences laughed or admired according to social expectations. Picture a medieval feast once more. Peasants drinking small ale in rough cups, merchants toasting with Rhine wine in pewter, nobles raising goblets of spiced hippocras in glittering halls. Every vessel, every flavour, every swallow carried meaning. Alcohol wasn't just liquid, it was class made visible, drinkable, and unforgettable. Picture a crowded medieval tavern in the late 15th century. The air is thick with smoke, the tables crowded with mugs of ale, goblets of wine, and the occasional horn of mead. Yet something new circulates among the wealthier patrons. A clear, burning liquid served in tiny cups called aqua vitae, the water of life. It is distilled, stronger than anything most people have ever tasted, and it hints at a future where traditional drinks like ale, wine, and mead will be joined, and in some places overshadowed, by distilled spirits. This moment captures the beginning of alcohol's shift from purely medieval forms into the foundation of modern drinking culture. The decline of mead, the transformation of brewing and winemaking, and the rise of new trade routes all ensured that while ale, wine, and mead shaped the medieval world, they would eventually give way to different patterns, leaving behind a powerful legacy. Mead was the first to lose ground. Honey was always expensive, requiring skilled beekeeping and careful harvesting. As sugar began to arrive in Europe via trade with the Mediterranean, and later from the colonies, honey lost its unique status as the only readily available sweetener. Mead's symbolic value persisted, especially in Scandinavia, Poland, and among aristocratic households, but it became more of a ceremonial or nostalgic drink than a daily staple. Wine and beer simply outproduced it on a scale honey could never match. By the 16th century, mead was increasingly marginalised, remembered as the drink of ancestors rather than the drink of choice. Ale, too, changed dramatically. The introduction of hops was the turning point. By the late medieval period, hopped beer from the Low Countries was no longer a foreign curiosity but a dominant force. English resistance faded, and brewers in towns like London and Bristol began adopting hops themselves. The shift wasn't just about taste, it was about preservation. Hopped beer lasted longer, travelled farther, and encouraged larger-scale brewing. Ale, as it had been known, unhopped, short-lived, and brewed mainly by women, gave way to beer, industrially scaled, brewed by guilds, monasteries, and eventually commercial enterprises. The gender balance shifted decisively. Brewing became a male-dominated profession, tied to urban economies rather than domestic cottages. Wine, meanwhile, only grew in prominence. The refinement of vineyard techniques by monastic orders and secular vintners alike created ever more prestigious vintages. Bordeaux, Burgundy, and the Rhine Valley built reputations that endure to this day. Wine became ever more tied to class and culture, especially among nobles and rising bourgeois elites. But even here, changes brewed. The expansion of maritime trade introduced new varieties, such as fortified wines from Iberia, precursors to sherry and port, that would soon rival traditional French and German vintages. Wine adapted to a changing world, and in doing so, it ensured its continued dominance among the wealthy. The greatest disruption came from distillation. What began as a medical experiment evolved into a cultural revolution. By condensing alcohol into higher strengths, distillers created drinks that were portable, long-lasting, and profoundly intoxicating. Aqua vitae spread rapidly, adopted by physicians, monks, and eventually ordinary drinkers. By the Renaissance, brandy, whiskey, and other spirits were on the rise, setting the stage for the early modern world. Compared to ale, wine, or mead, distilled spirits carried far more punch in smaller volumes, making them ideal for trade, naval voyages, and colonization. The water of life would outlive the medieval drinks that birthed it. Global trade also transformed alcohol. New routes opened to Asia, Africa, and the Americas, bringing sugar, coffee, cocoa, and exotic spices in unprecedented quantities. Rum, born from Caribbean sugar plantations, reshaped economies and tastes. Coffee and tea offered caffeinated alternatives, gradually challenging alcohol's role as the universal daily drink. Where medieval people drank ale for safety, modern people gained new options, shifting the balance of daily routines. Alcohol remained central, but its monopoly ended. The decline of mead and traditional ale wasn't total erasure, it was evolution. Mead persisted in pockets of Europe, revived in later centuries as a symbol of heritage. Unhopped ales survived in local traditions and festivals, remembered as links to a simpler past. Wine, of course, never disappeared, Instead, it grew ever more sophisticated. The medieval groundwork of vineyards, trade networks, and cultural associations ensured that wine remained one of Europe's defining drinks, bridging past and present. The legacy of ale, wine, and mead is still visible today. When you drink beer, you're tasting centuries of experimentation that began with medieval alewives and monastic brewers. When you sip wine, you're participating in rituals that stretch back to medieval churches, courts, and vineyards. When you try mead, you're connecting to one of humanity's oldest fermentations, cherished in medieval halls as a drink of myth and ceremony. Even spirits carry the medieval touch, born from alchemists' flasks in monasteries before becoming global commodities. But the medieval period left more than beverages. It left cultural scripts. The idea of the communal tavern, where people of all classes met, persists in modern pubs and bars. The ritual of toasting, raising a glass to honour someone or seal a bond, comes directly from medieval feasts. The link between alcohol and celebration, between drink and status, remains just as strong today as in the smoky halls of lords and the muddy greens of villages. Medieval people taught us not only how to drink, but how to drink together. Even the contradictions endure. Just as medieval preachers warned of drunkenness while pouring wine at the altar, modern society wrestles with alcohol's double-edged nature, celebrated in moderation, condemned in excess. The paradox that shaped medieval life still shapes ours. Alcohol as both necessity and danger, comfort and temptation. Now, as you sit back and let the story settle, think of the countless mugs, goblets, and horns lifted across the centuries. Each one carried more than liquid. It carried survival, faith, politics, and identity. It carried the laughter of feasts, the solemnity of sacraments, the whispers of conspiracies in taverns, and the quiet relief of peasants drinking safe ale instead of foul water. Ale, wine, and mead didn't just quench thirst. They built communities, sustained economies, and flavoured history. And now the pace slows, like the last notes of a song fading in a great hall after the feast. You feel the weight of centuries of brewing and drinking, but also the lightness of how familiar it all feels. People then, like people now, wanted safety, comfort, and celebration. They wanted to share a cup and feel part of something larger. The barrels may have changed, the recipes may have shifted, but the impulse remains the same, so let yourself drift. Imagine the warmth of ale on your tongue, the sweetness of mead, the sharp bite of wine, and even the fiery promise of spirits yet to come. Let the clamour of taverns soften, the chants of monks fade, the laughter of feasts blur into a hum. The story of ale, wine, and mead is the story of human connection, and it carries you gently now into silence. Like the last drop from a goblet, the tale lingers, warming you even as the night deepens. And with that, we close the barrel, cork the bottle, and hang the drinking horn on the wall. Sleep well, knowing the medieval world is still alive in every toast you raise.